Something happened in Cleveland that barely made noise on the surface, but behind the scenes it changed everything. No shouting, no rant, just one calm statement that quietly exposed a much bigger problem. During a routine press conference, Jimmy Haslam said something most people brushed past. He mentioned that a lot of the information out there wasn't accurate. Simple sentence, polite tone, but if you were paying attention, you could tell that wasn't just a throwaway line, that was a message. Because when an NFL owner chooses his words that carefully, especially on live TV, it's never accidental. For months, narratives have been flying around Cleveland. Questions about leadership, doubts about the quarterback room, constant speculation pushed as certainty. And suddenly, the owner himself is telling you, without naming names, that a lot of it doesn't line up with reality. And here where it gets interesting. When the Browns made one of the biggest moves of their offseason, the people who usually rush to break that story weren't involved at all. Local insiders were silent. Instead, the news came from Adam Schefter and ESPN. That detail matters more than most fans realize. Because that's not just about who broke a story, that's about trust, control, and who the organization actually wants shaping the narrative. At the center of all of this is Shedeur Sanders, a player who seems to attract noise no matter what he does. Some reports questioned his role, others questioned his leadership. And yet, every time those claims surfaced, they were immediately challenged, debunked, or walked back. So the real question becomes this: was Jimmy Haslam just talking about a coaching search, or was he quietly drawing a line between reality and rumor? Because once you connect the dots, it starts to feel like Cleveland isn't just changing coaches. They're changing how the story gets told. It started as one of those moments that feels routine until you replay it in your head. A standard press conference, normal questions, safe answers, and then Jimmy Haslam dropped a sentence that didn't sound explosive at first, but the more you think about it, the louder it gets. "There's all kinds of information out there," he said, "and with all due respect, a lot of it is not accurate." No raised voice, no frustration, no calling anyone out by name, and that's exactly why it landed the way it did. When an NFL owner chooses language that carefully, especially on live TV, it's not accidental, it's controlled, and it's intentional. Because let's be honest, owners don't usually push back on media narratives like that, not publicly, not unless something been bothering them for a while. This wasn't about one bad report or a single headline. This felt bigger. It felt like Haslam was drawing a line between what's actually happening inside the building and what's been floating around outside of it for months, and the timing made it impossible to ignore. The Browns had just wrapped up a highly emotional coaching search. Rumors were everywhere. Every outlet had a different version of who was favored, who failed interviews, and who ownership supposedly panicked over. Yet Haslam calmly shut all of that down with one sentence, essentially saying, "Most of what you're hearing isn't lining up with reality." What made it even more telling was what he didn't say. He didn't defend any specific decision. He didn't hype the hire. He didn't spin it. He focused on process, discipline, and patience, almost like he was reminding people that real decisions don't happen on talk shows or social media timelines. And that's where things start to feel uncomfortable for certain voices around Cleveland. Because when Haslam says a lot of it is not accurate, he's not talking about national hot takes. He's talking about narratives that have been repeated so often they started being treated like facts. Narratives about chaos, about confusion, about uncertainty at the top. But Haslam's tone suggested the opposite: calm, confident, certain. And once that realization sets in, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. If so much of the information has been wrong, then who's been getting it wrong and why? And that's where the story really starts to turn. What made Jimmy Haslam's comment hit even harder was what happened just before it. When the Browns finalized one of the most important decisions of their offseason, the story didn't come from Cleveland. It didn't come from local insiders. It didn't come from the people who usually have something to say first. Instead, the news broke through Adam Schefter and ESPN. That detail might seem minor at first, but in the NFL world, it's a massive tell. Local media almost always breaks local news, especially coaching hires. They're plugged in, they hear whispers, they're part of the daily ecosystem. So when a move this big skips that entire pipeline, it raises a quiet but important question: why? There's been a lot of buzz online suggesting the Browns intentionally tightened information flow during this search. Reports claim fewer leaks, fewer anonymous sources, less chatter reaching talk radio and social feeds. And whether that was strategic or situational, the result was the same: Cleveland media was no longer driving the conversation. That lines up perfectly with what Haslam said on the podium. Because if ownership believed inaccurate narratives were spreading, the fastest way to stop that isn't arguing, it's silence. You don't fight noise by feeding it, you starve it. And when only national outlets with established verification pipelines are getting the final call, that's a form of control. This doesn't mean Cleveland media was shut out entirely. It doesn't mean there was some dramatic fallout behind closed doors, but it does suggest a shift in trust. A recalibration of who gets access when decisions are finalized, not debated. And that's where things start to feel different. For months, Browns fans were flooded with constant speculation: who ownership favored, who failed interviews, who was panicking. But when the actual decision came down, none of that mattered. The end result bypassed the echo chamber entirely. That silence wasn't accidental. It sent a message without needing to say one. The organization wasn't interested in winning the news cycle. They were interested in finishing the process cleanly. And once you realize that, Jimmy Haslam's words start to feel less like frustration and more like clarification. Almost as if he was saying, judge us by what we do, not by what you hear. But here's the part most people missed. This shift didn't just affect reporters, it changed how certain players and certain narratives were about to be handled. And that becomes crystal clear once you look at who benefited most from the noise finally dying down. For months, the loudest conversations around Cleveland weren't about playbooks or schemes. They were about the quarterback room, and more specifically, the stories being told about Shedeur Sanders. Depending on where you looked, the narrative kept changing. One day it was about leadership. The next day it was about locker room presence. Then it turned into rumors about favoritism, separation from teammates, or whether he was being treated differently inside the building. None of it ever came with real sourcing, but it kept circulating anyway. That's how modern sports discourse works now. A claim doesn't need confirmation to spread, it just needs repetition. But here's the part that didn't age well. Almost every major talking point about Shedeur was challenged almost immediately. Fans pulled up videos, players posted responses, photos surfaced. Claims that once would have lingered for weeks were being fact-checked in real time, and suddenly, stories that sounded convincing on air didn't hold up when placed next to actual evidence. That shift matters. Because for a long time, traditional media controlled the pace of narratives. If something was said on radio or written in a column, it stuck until someone powerful enough corrected it. Now that delay is gone. Players, teammates, and even coaches can respond instantly, and they often do. That's what made the Shedeur conversation feel different. There's been a lot of buzz online suggesting that some outlets were uncomfortable with how quickly their claims were being challenged. Reports claim that what once passed as opinion was suddenly being treated like misinformation, and instead of slowing things down, that only created more friction. What gets lost in all of this is how little of it came from the Browns themselves. The organization rarely responded. No public corrections, no defensive statements, just silence. And in a way, that silence spoke volumes, because when teams don't rush to clarify every rumor, it usually means they're not panicking internally. It also explains why Jimmy Haslam's words landed the way they did. When he said a lot of the information out there wasn't accurate, it felt like an acknowledgement of this exact cycle. Not an attack, not a defense, just a quiet reset of expectations. And once you see it through that lens, the quarterback debate stops looking chaotic and starts looking controlled, almost like the noise was happening outside the building, not inside it. Which raises an even bigger question. If the Browns weren't buying into those narratives, then how were they actually evaluating the situation? Because the answer to that leads directly into why business, not headlines, might be driving the next phase of this story. This is where the conversation usually goes sideways because most fans talk about quarterbacks strictly in football terms: arm strength, scheme fit, wins and losses. But inside an NFL organization, especially at the ownership level, the equation is much bigger than Sunday afternoons. And that's exactly why the situation around Shedeur Sanders looks different depending on who you ask. From a football-only lens, people argue about readiness, development timelines, and competition. That's normal. But from a business perspective, the discussion expands fast. Visibility matters, engagement matters, attention matters, and in today's NFL, attention isn't a side effect, it's an asset. There's been a lot of chatter suggesting that Shedeur brings a level of interest most young quarterbacks simply don't. Social engagement spikes when his name trends, clips circulate faster, conversations stretch beyond the local market. None of that guarantees success on the field, but it absolutely changes how decisions are weighed at the top. Owners don't ignore that, they factor it in. That doesn't mean football takes a back seat. It means football and business are running in parallel. A quarterback who draws national attention while still being developed isn't just a project, he's leverage. He keeps the organization relevant while the roster grows. He buys patience. He keeps the spotlight warm instead of harsh. That's why the idea of casually moving on never really made sense from an ownership standpoint. There have been reports claiming that internally the Browns viewed the quarterback situation through a longer lens than outside voices realized. Not panic, not urgency, just patience paired with planning. And when you look at it that way, a lot of the noise suddenly feels disconnected from reality. Because here's the truth most debates skip over. Every quarterback the Browns could bring in would still need time, still need development, still need support. So if the football timelines are similar, the differentiator becomes everything around the player, not just what happens between the lines. That's where Shedeur stands out. And it also explains why ownership hasn't rushed to clarify every rumor or squash every headline. When the long-term vision is clear internally, outside noise doesn't force reaction, it just fades. Which brings this back to Jimmy Haslam's comment. When he said a lot of the information out there wasn't accurate, it didn't sound defensive. It sounded confident, like someone who knows the plan doesn't need to sell it publicly. And once business enters the conversation, the entire quarterback debate shifts from who starts now to who fits the future we're building. And that perspective sets up the next piece of the puzzle, because the coaching hire wasn't random. It was strategic. By the time the Browns officially announced their new head coach, a lot of people were already arguing about the order of interviews. Who came first? Who came second? Who was late to the process? But that debate completely misses what was actually happening behind the scenes. Because once you listen closely to what ownership said, it becomes clear that Todd Monken wasn't some last-minute pivot. He wasn't a backup plan. He wasn't someone who surged late because other options fell apart. He was the constant. Jimmy Haslam made that point without spelling it out. He talked about discipline, about process, about not getting emotional during a search that's designed to pull you in a dozen directions. And buried inside those comments was the most revealing detail of all: Monken had been at or near the top from the very beginning. That matters because NFL coaching searches are rarely clean, names leak, opinions shift. Media momentum starts pushing owners toward whatever feels safest in the moment. But this search didn't move like that. It stayed quiet, structured, almost boring from the outside. And that's usually a sign that the decision has already been narrowed internally. The obsession with interview order is mostly a media invention. It creates drama where there isn't any. Haslam shut that down directly, explaining that years from now, nobody will remember whether Monken was interviewed first, fifth, or eighth. The only thing that will matter is whether they got the right guy. That's not spin. That's ownership telling you the search wasn't reactive. There have been reports claiming the Browns valued Monken's clarity above everything else. His offensive identity, his ability to communicate, his comfort working with young players without overselling himself. And in a cycle filled with strong personalities, that steadiness stood out. That also explains why the Browns didn't rush the announcement. When a team feels uncertain, it leaks. When it feels confident, it goes quiet. Munkin didn't need a media campaign, he didn't need buzz, he didn't need anonymous praise floating around for weeks. The organization already knew what it wanted, and the search simply confirmed it. And here's the part that ties everything together. If Munkin was always the guy, then the quarterback plan was never random either. You don't hire a coach like that without already thinking about development, structure, and long-term fit. Which makes the next realization unavoidable. This wasn't just a coaching change. It was the foundation for a cultural reset, one that quietly shifted accountability, expectations, and power inside the building. And once that foundation is set, everything else starts to fall into place. This is the moment in the press conference where the tone shifted, even though the volume never did. A reporter asked a simple question about priorities in the coaching search, accountability, and player development, and Jimmy Haslam didn't hesitate. He said that when he and leadership spent time talking with players, one word kept coming up over and over again: accountability. That wasn't a soundbite, that was a signal. Because players don't repeat the same concern unless it's been missing for a while. And ownership doesn't repeat it publicly unless they want it heard by fans, by media, and by anyone still inside the building who needs to understand what's changing. What makes this moment so interesting is what Haslam didn't do. He didn't call out names, he didn't criticize the previous staff directly, he didn't frame it as failure. Instead, he framed it as feedback, honest input from players about what they felt was lacking. But in the NFL, feedback like that carries weight. There's been speculation that this was an indirect critique of the previous culture, not a condemnation, but an acknowledgement that things had gone stale, that structure had softened, that expectations weren't always clear or consistently enforced, and whether that perception is fair or not, it's clear ownership took it seriously. Accountability is one of those words that means different things depending on who's saying it. From a player, it usually means clarity, clear roles, clear consequences, clear standards. From ownership, it means alignment, everyone pulling in the same direction without mixed messages. That's why this comment mattered more than any scheme breakdown or win total prediction. Because when accountability becomes a public talking point, it signals a reset, a recalibration of how power flows inside the organization. And it also explains why the Browns prioritized leadership style as much as X's and O's in this hire. There have been reports suggesting that players wanted someone who would be direct, someone who wouldn't blur lines, someone who would coach hard but explain why. That kind of leadership doesn't always show up in headlines, but it shows up in locker rooms. And that's where this becomes bigger than one coach or one season. Haslam wasn't just talking about the past, he was setting expectations for the future, letting everyone know that development and accountability are now non-negotiable, not optional traits, not buzzwords, but requirements. Once you understand that, the coaching hire makes more sense. The quarterback plan makes more sense. Even the media silence starts to make sense. Because when accountability becomes the foundation, everything else, roles, competition, patience, falls into place. And that brings us to the next uncomfortable reality. If accountability is truly back on the table, then nobody, no matter their name or contract, is guaranteed anything. This is where things quietly got real. When Jimmy Haslam talked about the quarterback room, he didn't hype anyone, he didn't defend anyone, he didn't make promises. He simply said there were 3 quarterbacks on the roster and that the final call would belong to the new coaching staff. That might sound ordinary, but in the NFL, language like that is loaded. Because when ownership goes out of its way not to anoint someone, it usually means competition is coming, not manufactured competition, real evaluation. And that applies to everyone in the room, regardless of resume or reputation. Right now, that room includes Shedeur Sanders, Deshaun Watson, and Dylan Gabriel. On paper, that's a mix of experience, youth, and uncertainty. And instead of smoothing it over, ownership leaned into it. There have been reports suggesting that no quarterback was given private assurances during the transition. No "you're our guy" conversations, no symbolic gestures, just a clean slate handed to the new staff. That's rare and it's intentional. Because once accountability becomes the theme, guarantees disappear. For veterans, that means health and performance matter more than contracts. For younger players, it means development and consistency matter more than hype. And for the coaching staff, it means freedom, the ability to evaluate without pressure from above. That's why this moment matters for Shedeur. Instead of being protected or rushed, he's being placed in a structure designed to test readiness over time. That's not a setback, that's an opportunity, especially under a coach known for clarity and development. As for Dillon Gabriel, there's been growing speculation that his role is the least secure. Reports claim the Browns may explore additional options for depth, possibly reshaping the room entirely. Nothing confirmed, but the lack of endorsement speaks for itself. And then there's Watson. Haslam didn't sell optimism, he didn't downplay concerns. He simply said the evaluation would belong to the coach. That neutrality tells you everything. The organization isn't trying to force a narrative anymore, they're letting performance speak. That's the through line here. No promises, no politics, no media-friendly answers. Just competition. And once you understand that, the Browns' silence starts to feel intentional rather than evasive. They're not hiding a plan, they're executing one quietly. Which leads to the bigger realization. This isn't chaos, it's structure. And when a team commits to structure, the noise fades, the roles sharpen, and the future becomes clearer, whether people are ready for it or not. What's happening in Cleveland right now doesn't look loud, it doesn't look dramatic, and that's exactly the point. For the first time in a long time, the Browns aren't rushing to respond to every rumor, every segment, or every headline. They're not correcting narratives in real time, they're not feeding anonymous quotes into the cycle, they're letting silence do the work. And silence in this league is power. When Jimmy Haslam said that a lot of the information out there wasn't accurate, he wasn't inviting debate. He was closing the door. Since then, the organization has done something subtle but important. They've stopped chasing perception. That's a shift. There have been reports suggesting the Browns deliberately tightened communication internally. Fewer leaks, clearer channels, less access to half-formed ideas, and while none of that is flashy, it's how stable organizations operate. You don't announce every move, you don't argue with speculation, you let results speak later. This approach also changes how pressure works. When media noise runs the timeline, teams feel forced to react, benchings, statements, clarifications. But when leadership commits to quiet, the timeline slows. Decisions happen internally, not publicly, and players feel that difference immediately. It's not about secrecy, it's about control. That's why the Browns' recent moves feel coordinated instead of chaotic. Coaching hire, messaging, accountability, even how questions were answered or not answered at the press conference. Everything pointed in the same direction, fewer voices, clearer authority. And this matters for the future more than the past. A young roster doesn't need constant speculation hanging over it. A developing quarterback room doesn't benefit from weekly narrative swings. What it needs is structure, consistency, predictability inside the building, even if things look quiet on the outside. That's what this era seems to be aiming for. Even the stadium comments fit the theme: long-term investment, forward thinking, stability. You don't build something that big while panicking about headlines. So when people ask why the Browns aren't saying more, the answer might be simple. They don't need to. They've chosen to stop managing perception and start managing process. And while that can feel uncomfortable to fans used to constant updates, it's often the sign of an organization that finally knows what it wants. Which brings everything full circle. Jimmy Haslam didn't shut anyone down with anger, he didn't defend himself, he didn't argue. He clarified and then went quiet. And sometimes, the loudest statement an organization can make is showing that it no longer feels the need to explain itself. When you zoom out and replay everything that happened, the most important moment wasn't dramatic at all. There was no shouting, no finger pointing, no viral clip designed to dominate headlines, just a calm sentence from Jimmy Haslam that quietly changed the temperature around the entire organization. A lot of the information out there isn't accurate. That wasn't a defense, it wasn't frustration, it was clarification. And once you connect that statement to everything else, the silence around leaks, the coaching hire, the accountability emphasis, the open-ended quarterback situation, it becomes clear this wasn't about one press conference. It was about control, about drawing a boundary between speculation and reality. For a long time, the Browns felt like a team constantly reacting to headlines, reacting to narratives, reacting to outside pressure. But what we're seeing now feels different, measured, intentional, almost patient. That's why this moment matters so much for Shedeur Sanders. Instead of being pushed forward by noise or held back by doubt, he's being placed into a structure where evaluation happens internally, not publicly. Where development isn't rushed to satisfy talk shows, where performance, not perception, decides the future. And that's not just good for one player, it's good for the entire roster. When leadership stops feeding the rumor cycle, it gives coaches space to coach and players space to grow. It removes the constant feeling that every practice rep is being judged through a distorted lens. That's how stability starts, not with promises, but with consistency. What makes this moment so fascinating is how understated it was. No victory lap, no declarations, just a subtle shift in tone that told anyone paying attention the Browns are done arguing with narratives they don't recognize. They're choosing process over panic, structure over spectacle, long-term vision over short-term noise. And now the real test begins. Because silence raises expectations. If you don't explain yourself, you eventually have to show results. And that's the gamble Cleveland is making, one rooted in confidence rather than fear. So the question isn't whether Jimmy Haslam should have said more or less. The real question is this: was this the moment the Browns finally stopped letting the outside world define them? Or was it the quiet beginning of something that only makes sense once the results start showing up on Sundays? Either way, one thing is clear. The tone has changed. And Cleveland is no longer playing defense against its own story.